Thank you. One common attribute to many of the recent attacks has been that they were previously investigated by the FBI and they were found not to be credible threats. This would be true of the Boston bomber, the underwear bomber, the Garland shooter, the Orlando killer, and the most recent New York bomber. You know, we're all fallible, and I'm not here to say, gosh, FBI is terrible because it missed these things, but I'm also troubled, though, the FBI is unwilling to even admit that they may have made some mistakes. Every time these come up, what I hear from the FBI is, oh, no, we made no mistakes, we did exactly what we should have, and our conclusion was right given the information. Well, these are judgment calls, and the judgment calls were incorrect, and so I think we should at least admit that and then look at some of the facts. I'm also troubled that the FBI continues to ask for more power instead of saying, well, maybe we could use our current powers more efficiently and effectively. And I'll give you, I guess, an example. Mateen, the Orlando killer, investigated for a couple years, say we can't find enough information. Internal policies cause you to end the investigation. No law is saying you have to stop it. Maybe we should talk about whether or not the FBI's policy should change about how long we keep an investigation open. Mateen goes into a gun store. Gun store owner calls you. FBI shows up. FBI doesn't get the security footage. Well, I mean, local policemen in my hometown know to get the security footage. Everybody does it. That's the first thing you do in any kind of potential crime scene. Couldn't we have taken the security footage, matched it with, let's say, how many terrorist suspects live within 50 miles of that gun store? I don't think we're talking about thousands of people. I mean, we might be talking about 20 people. Couldn't we then present a list and pictures of the 20 people that we have suspects to the gun store owner? Couldn't we try to match them with the security footage? We went back for the security footage weeks later and it had already been erased. Let's admit these were mistakes. I'm not even saying let's hang somebody out to dry. Let's just admit we're not perfect and we made mistakes here, because if we don't admit to mistakes, we're not going to get better. So one is the length of the investigation. Should we have longer investigations? Are you changing any policy? Or are you going to tell us we made no mistakes and it's just one of those things? And with regard to opening investigations, I've asked repeatedly, why didn't you get a warrant? Why did you do this? Why are you closing the investigation? And I hear and read that the FBI's own internal rules say you have to have probable cause to open an investigation. Well, that sounds to me above and beyond the Constitution, and I'm a stickler for privacy and probable cause, but to investigate something doesn't, I wouldn't think, require probable cause to open an investigation. So I think you have all kinds of tools that maybe we're not using adequately, and yet there seems to be a great deal of lobbying by the FBI for new powers. You know, getting new third-party data, getting new metadata, new rules on encryption, banning technology and trying to get involved with technology, when in reality I think we need to admit maybe there are some problems in our current investigation. Also acknowledging that we're fallible and that we all make mistakes and that you can't be perfect and things will slip through. But I think to say, well, we said these people were not credible threats, but we didn't make a mistake. They just weren't. Well, they were credible threats, repeatedly. And when a parent says, my son is a terrorist, as a parent, I can tell you that's a pretty hard thing to do, that maybe we should try a little harder. The most recent guy was in jail, and they said, well, we didn't investigate him, he was in jail. Well, we never even prosecuted him, which is a whole nother criminal justice issue. You don't get prosecuted for stabbing your brother. But the thing is if he had a lawyer at the time, you should have at least requested. Maybe the lawyer says you can't talk to my suspect, but someone should have asked. He gets out of jail after 3 months. He's never prosecuted. Nobody ever follows up. I think there's a lot of public information you could have looked at. I think there's no reason why you couldn't open an investigation. And the standards get much lower when the investigations are open. The standard for the FISA warrant isn't probable cause. It's relevant to an investigation. And we can argue about that standard, but that's the current standard. I just don't think we're necessarily using our tools adequately. And I think it is important to admit when we make mistakes so we can improve our technique. And I guess my question to Director Comey is it your position that no mistakes were made in each of these in judging them not to be credible threats? Would you not have done more in the gun store that Mateen came into 6 weeks before the shooting? Would you not have done more when Rahami was arrested to question him because his dad said he was a terrorist?
Thank you, Senator. Sitting before you is a deeply flawed and fallible human being who believes very strongly in admitting mistakes when they're made. I hope you saw the very painful moment when I admitted publicly we made a mistake in allowing Dylan Roof to get a gun. So as long as I'm director of the FBI, we will stare back very carefully at what we do, and where we make mistakes, we will admit them, we will be transparent, and we will get better. As you know, I hope, I commissioned a look back at our investigation of the Orlando killer, which is just being completed now, and the Inspector General is going to do another one, which is great, because if there's learning there, we're going to squeeze it for all the learning we can and get better.
But what's your opinion on the gun store? Should we have done more in the gun store?
Your facts are wrong there.
Excuse me?
Your facts are wrong there. The gun owner did not call us contemporaneously. When we were contacted and went back to the store, it was the weeks afterwards, and so the video was not available. Your facts are also wrong with respect to what the bomber in New York, who's still alive and is going to have a trial, I hope, and be sentenced to jail for the rest of his life. So I want to be careful what I say. Your facts are wrong about what his father told the FBI. But there as well, we will go back and scrub our prior contact with that matter very, very carefully, and maybe the Inspector General will as well, which would be great as well. And if there's learning, we will learn from it. We are not perfect people. We aspire to be perfect because we think that's what the American people have a right to expect. But you will find us being very candid about our shortcomings and our strengths.
With regard to length of investigations and your internal policy on having probable cause to open investigations?
Yeah, that's just wrong as well. We don't need we need probable cause to get a search warrant or to get a wiretap, and I want to correct something else you said. You need probable cause to get a FISA warrant from the FISA judge. To open our investigations, the threshold is much, much lower. We open assessments based on just tips, then we open preliminary investigations and full investigations on much, much lower thresholds, because you investigate to see if there is probable cause.
So should we keep our investigations open longer?
We should keep them open as long as the facts warrant keeping them open. And there is no restriction. As you saw in Orlando, that preliminary is normally set for 6 months, can be extended another 6 and another 6 and another 6. We have the policies and the tools, by and large, that we need to do this well, which is why we need to look back at each case and say, so what did we do? Who did we interview? What documents did we get? And how could we do this better?
But that would be the judgment call. Should we keep them open longer?
Sure, and that judgment has to be made every day by professional agents with the review of their supervisors.
Senator McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I'll have a number of questions for the record about bioterror funding and BioWatch and TSA retaliation. I'm very concerned about those issues, especially since Admiral Nefflinger said that there had been no actions taken in regards to TSA whistleblower retaliations, and that doesn't match what's been reported publicly, and I'm trying to figure out what the facts are.
Consistent with the Second Amendment and consistent with a responsible gun owner's right to own a gun, we should give the Attorney General added discretion to deny a gun purchase to somebody who meets certain parameters similar to the parameters for the no-fly list or the terrorist watch list. So the answer to your question is yes, in my judgment. As a matter of Homeland Security, I think this is something we need to do.
Do you think that would be more effective? I mean, I think after the fact, it's very easy to say we should start grabbing surveillance tape in gun shops. Can you imagine the hue and cry if we started grabbing surveillance tapes in gun shops without probable cause of a crime being committed? I mean, you think the NRA is up in arms about wanting to make sure that we don't inconvenience anyone for a couple of weeks that's on the terrorist no-fly list. Can you imagine what the reaction would be if we started unilaterally seizing purchase video in gun shops? I mean, do you think, Director Comey, that's something that the FBI would even be comfortable doing without probable cause or without some reason to believe a crime has been committed?
We don't seize anything except pursuant to law, so we wouldn't be comfortable in doing anything outside of that construct.
So I guess the purpose of this line of questioning is, I do not get why we are having a long hearing on the danger of terrorists in this country, and we can't even take the baby step of saying someone who is going to be inconvenienced by missing a flight can't have the same inconvenience for buying an AR-15 that can kill a number of people in a short period of time that's on that same list. It is, I think, frankly, astounding to me, and I was really pleased to see last night that both presidential candidates agreed. So I'm hopeful that the people who have refused to vote for this in this body and on this committee will take another look at it, because I think we can pound our chests about how long you're investigating people or second-guessing the factual determination that goes into probable cause and seizing gun video of gun shops. But I just don't know how we can, with a straight face, say we're serious about this without taking that important step. I will say that I was in Jordan looking at the screening procedures. I know that both you are involved in your agency, Director Rasmussen and Director Comey, and I was astounded at how detailed the screening interviews and processes were on the ground in Syria. And I'm much more comfortable about that than the visa waiver program. And I made it. Look, look. Huh?
I certainly appreciate that.
You didn't even have to yell at me.
I appreciate it. I will say the answer to your question is because terrorists kill people with knives and homemade bombs and trucks. That's why. Senator Ayotte.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank all of you for your service to the country. Director Comey, I wanted to follow up on one of Senator Paul's questions and start with this in terms of the Mateen situation in Orlando. I understand that he was interviewed twice by the FBI, and then the inquiry was closed. Is that true?
Yes, he was interviewed twice during a 10-month, 11-month investigation. Then the preliminary was closed.
So in that investigation, was there any work done to see what he was doing online? In other words, you interviewed him in person. Was there anything looked at to see what he was doing online?
As I understand it today, there were no search warrants for his the content of any of his devices or the content of his held by a service provider.
But I guess my question is, there's even work you can do without a search warrant just publicly. Was anything done to see whether he was saying anything online or doing anything without going into getting a search warrant at that point?
In public, like public posting,
Public space.
social media?
Public space. Did the FBI do anything?
I don't know the answer. I don't think so at this point.
Okay, so one of the things that, as I understand too from what I've heard in prior briefings, that was not done. And as I look at the situation, one thing that I would assume that we would do in every investigation, even before we got to the level of looking for content, is to see if there's anything in the publicly available space that individuals you're following up on may be saying, or about terrorism, about any extreme figures. Would you agree that that would be a natural step in an investigation?
Maybe, and maybe that's one of the things we learned from our look back. It would depend upon the investigation. In this one, they had two sources who were speaking to him, including taping conversations with him. So I think the case agent thought they had a pretty good vector into his state of mind.
Well, I guess my question goes to are there lessons learned, and was everything done well in Orlando? This one seems obvious to me, that when you have an individual who's made some extreme statements, you're interviewing them. We know also that you tried to verify through secondary means, but it just seems surprising to me that there wasn't some kind of online work done in something so significant. So that to me is of deep concern. I hope you will give us a report exactly of what was done or not done in that instance. And I'm in the camp of, one of the things I know is important to the FBI, because you've testified before other committees, is wanting the authority, what's called the ECTR fix, or the electronic transactions records fix. Can you explain the significance of that to this committee and why it's important? Because having been a prosecutor before this, I can assure you that in your basic child pornography case, internet predator case, I was able to get these types of records. And tell us how you're being limited right now and why you need us to fix it.
Sure. For many years, we were able to issue national security letters, which are issued in our national security cases, counterintelligence or counterterrorism cases, for telephonic transaction records and internet transaction records, not the content of people's calls or their emails, but the IP addresses involved and who they communicated with on the internet and by telephone. Several years ago, lawyers for some internet service providers started to interpret the statute to say, if you read the language, it actually, through what I think was a mistake, should not allow you to use an NSL to get transaction records on the internet where you can get them on telephony, and interpreted that way. The fix that we think because we think Congress intended to allow us to use NSLs in both circumstances, is to allow us to get non-content for telephone transaction records and internet transaction records.
And you would agree this is a very common tool in criminal cases, just average criminal cases, where you're not getting content, but you are actually, in many instances, issuing a subpoena to get the basic electronic records. And it seems absurd to me that we can't do that basic fix that only failed the Senate by 1 vote. So I hope we can get you that authority. I wanted to follow also up on the most recent case where Mr. Rahami has been arrested. And in that instance, I know Senator Paul had asked you about that, but one thing is what the public reports of what is out there, it's my understanding that he was actually flagged by the Department of Homeland Security after he arrived back from Pakistan, and notified by the National Targeting Center based on when he was stopped at the airport. And that National Targeting Center, as I understand it, is under Homeland Security. And as a result of that, that information was passed on to the FBI. Later, in August of 2014, Mr. Rahami's father makes some type of report to him. I know with some connection to terrorism. And at that point, that was also provided to the FBI. So the reports are that he was never interviewed there. So what I think we're trying to understand is these are basic steps that when you have someone traveling to Quetta, Pakistan, even if they have family members there, we know that's a hub of terrorism in a very dangerous place. And that flag and that travel history combined later with a report where a family member reports a potential tie with terrorism and yet no in-person interview. So can you help us understand, do you have enough people? Is there some reason why he wouldn't be interviewed? And what are the things we need to learn from this? Because obviously we want to prevent it in the first place, but when something like this comes through your doors, we want to make sure it's followed up on so that we can do all we can with local law enforcement to stop these things before they start.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I will at some point want to have that conversation. I don't want to have it now for 2 reasons. First, this is an active investigation. This guy's alive and entitled to a fair trial, and I don't want to do anything that gives him an opportunity to claim we deprived him of that right. And second, I don't know yet. We're going to go back and look very carefully at the way we encountered him, and we will find the appropriate forum to give you that transparency about what we did well, what we could have done better, what we've learned from it. We haven't done that work yet because we're doing an active investigation, so I don't want to comment in this forum beyond that right now.
Well, I appreciate that, but I think this is a really important question for all of us. Number one, do you need different legal authorities? Number 2, do you need more agents? Number 3, was it something that was missed that this individual was not interviewed despite these flags? If we look at the Orlando situation, if we go back to Sarnav, each one of them, putting them together, what more do we need to do? What are the lessons learned? And if you need additional support, we need to know about it very quickly. So, thank you.
Senator Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each one of you for being here today, and thank you for the work you do. And a special thank to you, Jay, since this is the last time in front of this committee. Jay, you had brought up support for state governments on election tampering. Could you give me an idea on how prevalent this is by foreign governments?
We are seeing a limited number of instances where there have been efforts through cyber intrusions to get into the online presence of various state election agencies. And 1 or 2 of them have been successful, others have not. But more broadly, just in the general environment, Senator, that we're in, where we have an increasing level of sophistication with nation-state actors, hacktivists, and so forth, we've been out there saying to state election officials, if you need help, just ask us for it. So,
and they're getting into the databases and changing the votes. That's what they're doing.
No, that's not it. The matters are under active investigation. I think there's a limited amount we can say.
Okay.
But what we are seeing are efforts to get into voter registration rolls the identity of registered voters, that things of that nature,
And
not to
those.
change a ballot count.
Okay, and change those. So that a
Not to
person,
change votes, no.
no, but to change so a person who would normally be registered would not be registered then? Is that what we're talking about? Or to register people who aren't registered?
I cannot say that.
Okay,
No,
all
I
right.
cannot say that.
All right. And is this coming from one particular country?
I don't believe that we have reached a determination of that nature to that extent.
Okay. We talk about the southern border a lot. I always talk about the northern border.
Yes, you do.
And I do want to talk about that for a second in the arena of communications. We have been told by folks who work under you on the ground on the northern border that there are gaps of communication on the northern border. Are you aware of those gaps? Number one, yeah. Are you aware of those gaps in communication? Do they exist?
It's something that I've heard about, and I know you have an interest in this. Frankly, I would not be surprised if there were some level of gaps in communications that should not exist.
Right. And I guess the next question is then if you do have gaps, which is not unreasonable, it's something we need to work on, though, to get fixed, do you have workarounds on those gaps through local law enforcement or highway patrol or municipal sheriff departments, whatever it might be?
I'd have to get back to you on that, Senator.
Could you check on that? Because I think that's, if we have dead zones in the northern border, that is a particular problem concern that, quite frankly, is pretty basic. And if you could find out and just let me know,
Sure.
That would be great. I want to talk a little bit about, since this is your last meeting, Jay, about DHS. I mean, DHS is a behemoth of an agency. I mean, it's massive, and you've done a masterful job in your job there. I think you report to a number of committees. I think maybe 119 congressional committees and subcommittees. 119.
Depending on how you count, yes, sir.
Yeah, well, I count in base 7, so there may be less than that, but or there may be more. Do you have any ideas? I mean, I can't imagine, number one, from an accountability standpoint, it doesn't make much sense to me, because how can this work? And number two, do you have any actions that you think Congress could do on your way out that would make your accountability better and, quite frankly, more functional?
Well, first, we've actually, notwithstanding the number of committees and subcommittees, we've actually reduced the amount of time it takes to respond to a congressional inquiry pretty significantly since I've been secretary.
Yeah.
And we do spend a lot of time responding to requests. I will say that I read every letter from a member of Congress that comes in. About half of them are from the same two people. No names mentioned here.
You're welcome.
It's called oversight.
You're not one of the two. No, no, sir. The real problem with having so many committees, being divvied up among so many committees, it's very tough to get any kind of comprehensive authorization of our activities through Congress. That's the real substantive problem with having so many committees of oversight.
Is there a solution to that? I mean, is there a solution? Should we just give it to this one and then be done with it?
I would say, look, in a perfect world,
Yeah.
I would say one oversight committee for authorization, one committee for appropriations, just like my Department of Defense days. We had armed services and we had appropes, and that was it.
Yep.
And if I appeared before any other committee, I got in big trouble. So.
Okay. And this is for both you and for Jim Comey. Canada has changed its policy with Mexicans traveling up to Canada, and there's not much we can do about that. It's between those two countries. But this policy, and I think I sent you a letter on it, and in fact I know I sent you a letter on it, and I think you responded to it, and I appreciate you read it. Has this changed our posture at all towards the northern border because of potential appearance of loosening of travel restrictions?
Well, it depends on how they arrive into Canada. If it's by air, that's one thing. If it's on land, that's another. I will say that we are building information sharing agreements with the government of Canada.
Okay.
so that we have a better sense for who's coming and going across our border into Canada, and I think we need to keep moving in that direction.
Okay. Last thing is because it's been claimed here a couple times, do you see yourselves as only playing defense?
That's an interesting question. When I was at DOD, signing off on a lot of targeted lethal force as consistent with law, I suppose I was on offense. I think it's inherent in the DHS mission that we are on defense, but I think it's also incumbent upon us to have an affirmative agenda for improving our mission and how we do business. So I've tried to do both.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first and foremost, I just want to thank you all for your work. It's incredible the dedication you all have. You are truly patriots to our country, and obviously what we all witnessed happening in New Jersey and New York this past week is a further affirmation of the quality of your commitment to the security of our homeland. And I appreciate you saying earlier, Director Comey and Director Johnson, that this is a multiple level commitment from local authorities as well as state and federal authorities, because what we saw, the commitment of amongst the Linden police officers, for example, who literally took fire from a terrorist, saved lives. I reached out to the two gentlemen last week, and truly heroic work being done at every level of our government. Secretary Johnson, I've been very concerned and focused on issues of rail security. It's something that I feel we're not doing enough, especially given the Northeast Corridor. More people travel along the Northeast Corridor by rail than they do on air travel. We've seen that the pipe bombs found in the Elizabeth train station were near Amtrak, New Jersey Transit, where millions of people ride in the state of New Jersey. In 2007, Congress actually passed legislation requiring that the TSA and other agencies implement a number of recommendations that came out of the 9/11 committee. Among them were several requirements for the TSA to issue regulations that would provide direction to public transportation agencies, railroads, and bus companies on securing security training for frontline transportation workers. Since the passage of the legislation, there have been several critical events, from the Brussels metro bombing to more recently, again, what we saw in New York and New Jersey near train stations. And if you look at it from a larger perspective, since 2001, there's been more than 1,900 attacks have been carried out against transit systems globally, resulting in thousands of deaths, about 4,000, and 14,000 injuries. However, TSA currently has less than 800 full-time employees dedicated to protecting surface transportation assets, which is less than 2% of the agency's workforce. If you just look at the proportion of what we're applying to air travel versus surface travel, you see it's almost as if we're fighting still the 9/11 efforts and not really looking forward to what the attacks are we're seeing consistently around the globe today. I've been discussing this with TSA status. I've been writing letters about it. I hope I'm not in your top two, but definitely have been pushing this for some time, and it's growing. Frankly, it's just becoming very frustrating to me. And so I just want to ask very specifically, can you please provide me with a very specific timeline on when the TSA is going to finish its work on the 9/11 Commission's recommendations, Secretary Johnson?
Yes, we can get you that timeline. Beyond that, I will say I'm also a regular user of the Northeast Corridor and New Jersey Transit, and so I'm very familiar with rail security. Frankly, I believe that TSA's principal focus should continue to be aviation security, given the threat streams that we all see. That needs to be their number one priority. They do have the rail security mission as well, but as you know, Senator, we've got Amtrak Police, New Jersey Transit Police to support that mission as well. But I would like to see us continue to develop that aspect of TSA's mission so that we're in a better place.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate your commitment to get me a timeline. Just an issue of proportionality, 2% going to surface transportation 90+% going to aviation. At least in terms of proportionality, does it seem a little out of whack?
I'd want to think about that a little bit more. Again, when it comes to rail, we've got other security forces out there supporting the mission. And so I'd want to think about whether that's the right ratio or not. I continue to be concerned about aviation and airport security, and I believe that needs to be TSA's principal focus.
And I'm not arguing with that. Again, I look forward to getting the timeline. And just real quick, Director Rasmussen and Director Comey, do you believe that Rahami was part of a cell of other terrorists that were planning attacks?
That investigation, as I said earlier, is open. We see so far no indication of a larger cell or the threat of related attacks.
And it's interesting you're seeing a spiking of violent extremism happening. Secretary Johnson, I appreciate his talk about terrorist diasporas like I've never been seen before as we win on the ground, continue to win on the ground in Syria and Iraq. Can you give me sort of more of an idea of why do you think there's a spike going on, and what are some of the root causes of this?
For me, Senator?
Yes, either one.
Well, at least what I was talking about in terms of the terrorist diaspora is we know thousands, tens of thousands by some measures, of fighters have flocked to the so-called caliphate. Many have died in battle there, and many more will die as the caliphate is crushed. What I'm talking about is the future that we have to focus on.
So can you just hone in on 215? There's been a spike, right? And so this isn't necessarily a result of the gains that we're making in Syria and Iraq. Do you have another understanding of why we're seeing a spike in 2015 and seemingly in 2016 as well?
Well, we saw a spike in the United States of
Yes.
people moving towards violence because ISIL started investing in their social media campaign in 2014. It paid dividends starting in the spring of 2015, where troubled souls started to flock to it electronically and be motivated to move to violence. We've made progress against that, against locking those people up and disrupting some of that narrative, and so the numbers have come down slightly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to explore well, first of all, thank you for being here, appearing today, and for your work. I want to continue to explore what you talked about, Director Comey, with regard to sort of the impending terrorist diaspora when the caliphate is crushed. In your testimony before us this morning, you talked about the fact that this is not an often looked at area, but that work is underway, and you assured us of that. I guess I would ask you and Director Rasmussen about sort of what your early estimates are of what that is going to look like globally. And sort of the where, when, who. I understand the things that are that we have to know first when this, when we consider action on the ground to be concluded. But I'd like to hear what your early estimates are, and then what sort of strategic changes we should look towards domestically. What's going to be the impact of that diaspora domestically? What sort of policy and resource implications does that have? So realizing that we're not in a classified setting, tell us what you can about that work underway.
Certainly, Senator. And then Nick will both check me and probably make the answer more thoughtful, but I'll take the first shot. Certainly at least hundreds of fighters are not going to die in the coming crushing of the caliphate. The caliphate, as Nick Rasmussen has said and Secretary Johnson has said, been steadily losing territory. There's going to come a point where it's going to be essentially crushed. I don't know exactly how to estimate that over the next couple of years. through the fingers of that crush are going to come some very, very bad people, a much larger diaspora than we saw, for example, out of Afghanistan after the Mujahideen, the conflict with the Soviets ended in the late 1980s.
Study panel on biodefense and basically declared that the United States is unprepared for biological threats. The Government Accounting Office also has found that the biodefense enterprise is fragmented. It's lacking strategic oversight necessary for efficiency and accountability. And certainly I'm concerned that a bioterror attack could be the next threat that we have to deal with, and we need to be prepared. Secretary Johnson, I'm particularly interested in the DHS use of BioWatch program developed to provide early detection of a bioterrorism event. As you know, last year the GAO identified flaws with BioWatch, including that it isn't really possible to test it in an operational environment. So could you give us an update on BioWatch and some of your efforts related to bioterrorism, please?
Senator, it's been a focus of mine. We have an office and a mission dedicated to the chem bio threat to the homeland. I'd be happy to give you a more fuller written report on exactly where we are with BioWatch. But this has been a focus of mine, and obviously it's been a focus of others, including Secretary Ridge. And the way I look at it is this: all three of us deal with this every day. There are threats that are high probability, and then there are threats that are perhaps lower probability but high impact, high cost. And we've got to be responsible and keep our eyes on all of it, and that includes the chem bio threat to the homeland. But I can get you a fuller report in response to your question, sir.
Well, I appreciate that, and I realize that you have multiple threats, and you do have to make those kinds of assessments on a regular basis. But certainly something of this nature, as you mentioned, even if the probabilities may be lower at this time, the impact is significant. And when you look at some of the new technologies that are coming on board in biotech, CRISPR technology, for example, which could be used in some very nefarious ways, certainly has incredible potential, but also you can buy these kits fairly inexpensively and could present some significant issues. In my remaining time, I just want to touch on cybersecurity, another area that is critical for us and perhaps one of our biggest threats that we have as a country. I had the opportunity to be out yesterday and visit with folks at NSA and with the Cyber Command, and I'm encouraged by the cooperation that I saw. I know a couple of you have mentioned about how we're now working together on the cyber, all the agencies coming together. I saw that firsthand. It was refreshing to see. But I'd just like a brief comment on an area that I see as a vulnerability that we have to be thinking about, is that when it comes to cyber risk, it's usually the weakest link is where the bad guys are going to go. And although the agencies have hardened systems and our departments have done, I think of small local governments, I think of small businesses, others. We know some of the attacks that we've seen, cyber attacks, have gone through contractors that are small contractors tied to a larger organization. So I see some significant threats from that potentially through local governments, municipalities, as well as small businesses. Are there things that we should be doing here in Congress to aid those efforts? Because I know all three of you are very aware of that.
Well, I'll just start real quick. First of all, I'm very appreciative of the law Congress passed last year on cybersecurity, which has greatly aided what we do in DHS. When you talk about the weakest link is always the employee vulnerable to an act of spear phishing. And so the very basic thing that all of us need to do is raise employee awareness among our respective workforces to the hazards of spear phishing. The most sophisticated attacks very often occur just simply through an act of spear phishing.
Senator Booker.
Director Comey, I'd like to change the direction of my questioning specifically to issues of race in America. There's been a lot of talk recently about law and order, and you and I both, you in your position, me when I was mayor and had a city with high levels of violence and crime, really did focus on law and order, and it's critically important. But we make a distinction in America between law and order, which is a baseline, but we seek a higher level of standard, and that is justice. We pledge allegiance to this idea of liberty and justice for all. We look at our highest ideal is on the Supreme Court building, equal justice under the law. Now, in Birmingham in 1960, there was law and order, but there was a clear lack of justice. And many people complained when some rabble-rousers, outside agitators, came in, literally breaking some laws, actually, but exposed the fact that there was law and order, but without justice. Now, King wrote eloquently in the letters from the Birmingham jail about that distinction, really focusing on the difference between law and order, which he used Germany and other areas as places that had law and order but didn't have justice. We are Americans, and we strive for that ideal. Now, what frustrates me is 50 years from that time, we still seem to be dealing with a lot of the same issues. The Kerner Commission, put forth by Johnson 50 years ago, was seeking to diagnose why there was so much violence and rioting in cities, as well as nonviolent protests going on, and the report identified police incidents as the most common cause of riots and criticized the over-policing of black neighborhoods. Now, what frustrates me is that you read the Kerner report, you read the letters from the Birmingham jail, and you read your words, sir, your courageous words, and you see we're still struggling from those issues. Now, you gave a speech that I found amazing. I actually used your speech in my book that I wrote. New York Times called it an unusually candid speech, and for the record, this is what you wrote. When the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, the death of Eric Garner in Staten Island, the ongoing protests throughout the country, and the assassinations of New York City police officers, we are at a crossroads, you stated. As a society, we can choose to live our everyday lives, raising our families, going to work, hoping that someone somewhere will do something to ease the tension, to smooth over the conflict. We can roll up our car windows, turn up the radio, and drive around these problems. Or we can choose to have an open and honest discussion about what our relationship is today, what it should be, what it could be, what it needs to be, if we took our time to better understand one another. These are your words, sir. Much research points to the widespread existence of unconscious racial bias. Many people in our white majority culture have unconscious racial biases and react differently to a white face than to a black face. In fact, we all, white and black, carry these biases around with us. But if we can't help our latent biases, we can help our behavior in response to these instinctive reactions, which is why we need to work to design systems and processes that overcome the very human part of us all. Although the research may be unsettling, it is what we do next that matters most. You were incredibly courageous in this speech about talking about racial bias in policing. You and I both have an adherence to the idea of data. We have wild conversations in America, and sometimes I listen to it, and it seems like we're not even talking to each other. We're not leading with courageous empathy. But what I am frustrated about is, while I think we need that empathetic, courageous empathy to begin to create the understanding to heal as a country, we still consistently, 50 years since the Kerner report, based on data, have different standards of justice being applied to different communities in our country that is creating understandable tension. And frankly, if we saw the over-policing that the Kerner report talked about being done in other areas of affluence, we would have a very different reality in American politics because it wouldn't be tolerated. Now, you go on in this great speech to talk about specific needs that we have if we're going to correct this problem. You state, not long after riots broke out in Ferguson late last summer, I asked my staff to tell me how many people shot by police were African American in the country. I wanted to see the trends. You wanted the data. I continue in your words. I wanted to see the information. They couldn't give it to me, and it wasn't their fault. Demographic data regarding police officer-involved shootings is not consistently reported to us through our Uniform Crime Reporting Program. Because reporting is voluntary, our data is incomplete and therefore is not in the aggregate is not available. I recently listened to a thoughtful big city police chief. I stop here and say, you and I both know there are lots of police departments that are trying to do very good things about confronting implicit racial bias. There are a lot of good, thoughtful leaders in this country who recognize, like you do, that this is a problem. I continue in your words. thoughtful big city police chief, his frustration with the lack of reliable data. He said people didn't know whether the Ferguson police shot one person a week, one a year, or one a century. And what the absence of good data, all we get are ideological thunderbolts, when what we need are ideological agnostics who use information to try to solve a problem. And you say he is right. And so I don't want to be here 50 years from now or listening to my kids and grandkids struggle with what should have been done in the 1960s when thoughtful police leadership like you called for understanding this data of what does exist in our country, which is racial bias. And so I've put forth legislation saying, hey, let's get away from the ideological thunderbolts and get the data. We can't solve a problem unless we measure it. You're a manager of an agency. I was a manager of a city. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so I want your opinion on basically what you've stated clearly on the need for national collection of data on implicit racial bias on police interactions with communities.
You could provide that as a written answer to that question?
Sir, that is, you allowed so many other people to go over. My time has just ended.
Not
Why
really. Not really. I'm going to ask another round. You can ask another round. Okay, I'm going to keep this 7 minutes. There are 3 questions I want to ask based on your testimony as well as other questions asked during the hearing. First, Secretary Johnson, it appears now this administration has let in about 10,000 refugees from Syria. I've certainly been on the record saying one of the ways we could minimize any kind of risk would be to establish criteria. I've suggested women, children, relatives of Syrian American citizens that have the financial wherewithal to support them. Is the department in any way, shape, or form establishing a criteria? Are we just vetting whoever the agency from the UN is providing us in terms of asking us to take in refugees?
We established criteria in the following sense. Between us, the State Department, UNHCR, we focus on people who we think would be good candidates for resettlement in the United States. That's number one. We have criteria in the sense that we've added security checks to the process, and if you fall into a certain criteria, there's going to be extra vetting. That was particularly true around Syrians. And so we made the 10,000, frankly, by surging a lot of resources and adding a lot of people to it. But we do have criteria. The criteria are not all public, and they shouldn't be. But we added security to the process, to the vetting process.
So you are fairly confident that the vetting has been robust. We haven't taken any risks. I mean, I'm the lead sponsor of the SAFE Act. That would have asked you 3 gentlemen to certify that. But are you very satisfied that the 10,000 Syrians we've let into this country represent no risk to America?
I'm satisfied and comfortable that we put a lot on this process with a lot of additional security, a lot of additional person power, and I know for a fact that an awful lot of the 10,000 are families, women and children who are fleeing violence, fleeing terrorism, and will be honest, hardworking people in this country.
Okay. In testimony, we talked about more robust use of social media.
Yes.
Looking at that when we're evaluating and vetting refugees. Can you describe that in a little more greater detail? One of the things I've suggested, I've certainly asked people, why not have anybody seeking refugee status come in with their devices and basically have a plug-in program that can very rapidly scan these things, and how are you doing it? And are we trying to utilize technology to the maximum effect to do what I'm suggesting?
Senator, I want to expand the use of social media, not just for refugee vetting, but for visa-free travel, for example. We have a notice and comment period we just completed on adding social media questions in the ESTA system right now.
But again, those are questions. Is there any automated system where literally you ask people to come in with their devices, whether they're seeking a visa or whatever, you just plug it in and bam,
The answer to your question is we have a system for vetting social media. We need better technology so that it's not manual.
So right now it is manual.
It's manual and it's time-consuming, which is why we need an investment in the technology so that we can look at social media, not just for refugee vetting, but for a whole host of things that this department, and I suspect other departments, use it for.
My guess is that's technology that ought to be rapidly developed. I mean, am I incorrect there, either Director Comey or Director Rasmussen? Can you weigh in on that one way or the other?
I don't have any specialized knowledge on that particular question.
I do know it's something that we work hard to develop the technology for our investigations to go through huge amounts of seized media and publicly available social media. So no, there are tools out there. Whether it's fit for this purpose or not, I don't know.
Well, I would suggest your department, your agency work together on that. Finally, Director Comey, I do want to talk a little bit about these terror watch lists because I think we're throwing a lot of terms around and people don't really understand them. So I just want to make sure people understand what we're talking about here. From my understanding, the overall massive database is really the TIDE, the Terrorist Identities Data Mart environment. And again, I'm not sure what's law enforcement sensitive, so I don't want to talk about numbers, foreigners versus Americans. A subsidiary list of that is the terrorist screening database. And then much smaller subsets of that are no-fly lists and selectee lists, correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
None of these lists were ever developed. They were developed for law enforcement use, to give you an indication whether or not you should investigate somebody or somebody should be pinged for further investigation, correct?
They're intelligence and law enforcement databases. There are standards to get identities in there, but their primary purpose currently is for that.
They are far from perfect, correct?
Correct.
The standards for getting onto those databases are not exactly what you call completely tight. But let me put it this way. They were never intended to deny an American constitutional rights, correct? That would be a misuse of those lists?
I think that's fair to say. I hope that's true of all of our work.
How do you get off the lists?
You get off the list either, and Nick will help me with this, but you get off the list either when an investigation has been closed and then the agent sends the appropriate notification to have the name removed, or you make use of the redress procedures that DHS runs to challenge and have it looked at and then have your name removed if it's a mistake.
Of course, you have to know that you're on the list in order to seek redress, and then even there, that's not a judicial process, correct? That's just through the agency, and let's face it, a bureaucrat in the agency will make the final determination. You don't have the ability to get redress through the courts.
It's an administrative process, but people do and have gone to court to challenge beyond that, as I recall.
But again, you have to know you're on the list.
That's
correct. That does represent a problem. And again, I'll understand if you don't want to speak to this in open session, but I think you've had some reservations about utilizing those in terms of those lists tipping off some of you may be investigating. Are you willing to speak to that at all?
I think what I can say in open setting is I just want to be thoughtful about any operational impacts to anything that we set up.
Okay. My time is up. I'm happy to let you respond to Senator Booker or Senator Carper. Do you have further questions?
Yeah, I just want to give my time to Senator Booker. Go ahead, please.
And Mr. Chairman, just for the record, it's ironic that I was giving a question about equal application of the law, and you did not equally apply the rules. If I can finish, sir. You literally even said to somebody, since there's only a few people here, I'll let you go a little longer. And right before, you seem to be incredibly strict with your application of the rules to me.
I cut other people off as well. Now you can ask the question.
I'd like for the record, the details of how long people went over, so I can point out to the chairperson how many minutes he allowed other people to go over. And then when I'm bringing up issues of race and equal application of the law, you suddenly cut me right off.
That's an absurd characterization, but now you can get your answer.
Sir, I'm not a characterization. I'd like that for the record, at least so you could see how you're conducting the hearing, sir. Director Comey, I'm going to finish my the last paragraph of your speech that I did not read, going back so I can heighten that issue of data. The first step to understanding what is really going on in our communities and in our country is to gather more and better data related to those we arrest, those we confront for breaking the law and jeopardizing public safety, and those who confront us. Data seems to be dry and boring, seems to be a dry and boring word. Without it, we cannot understand our world and make it better. Could you please comment on the lack of data in regards to policing in the United States and how hard it makes us to address the issue of implicit racial bias in policing?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Booker. This is one of the most important issues we confront in the FBI, I think we confront as Americans. There are all kinds of people of tremendously good hearts in law enforcement, not in law enforcement, in communities of color, protesting. Every single one of them is unguided by actual data and information. Every conversation, in my view, about the use of force and race in policing in this country is uninformed. People of tremendous goodwill trying to resolve these things. What we could contribute as a country is information to that conversation for the reasons you say, so that great people who care deeply about these things can come to solutions that are practical and just. We simply must collect data that is reliable nationwide about police use of deadly force in altercations, encounters with civilians. We simply must. If there is anything more inherently governmental than that, I can't imagine what it is. But we're now in a situation where we've got newspapers that are the only source of that kind of data, and their data isn't comprehensive. We are going to do this. I have spoken to, one of the beauties of a 10-year term is I am not going to shut up about this. I got 7 years to go. We will build a nationwide database that the FBI will collect that shows us what happened when, who was involved, what were they like, what were the circumstances, so we can have informed conversations. No one in this country knows whether the use of deadly force against any particular group, African Americans most particularly, is up, down, or sideways over the last 10 years. Nobody knows. Do we have an epidemic of violence? No one knows that. We could, we might not. We simply must gather the information so we can care deeply and solve these problems.
Director Comey, I really celebrate your leadership around this issue. As was said, the courageous speech you gave and your remarks right now. But the one thing I'll ask you, sir, is where we do have data, it shows an alarming fact pattern in our country. Not only the studies that you cite about implicit racial bias in your speech, but the Department of Justice has dozens and dozens of police departments, including the one that I ran, where I was even surprised at the data they collected to begin to create transparency. So police department after police department where we do now have the data is showing very dramatic, from New York City to New Orleans to Ferguson, showing dramatic biases in policing. So doesn't that lead you to believe, or that you see this consistent fact pattern where we have collected the data, that we don't just have a problem in the United States, to a nation that aspires to high levels of justice and equality under the law, don't we have a policing crisis in this country given the data that we do have?
I believe we have a chasm in this country that in many places where a divide is open and opening between law enforcement and communities, especially the African American community. It is the causes for it are complicated and long-standing, but not elusive. Right? We can stare at it. We have problems, things we can do better in law enforcement that are obvious, and we're working very hard to change. Where I think we can close the chasm is everybody wants the same kind of policing. Everybody does. Moms and dads and law enforcement want the same kind of policing. Up close, responsible, lawful, firm, but fair policing, transparent. We are safer when we have it. And the good news for America is there are a ton of police leaders who feel exactly as I do, and we are going to drive that chasm closer together, because it's the way to save lives in this country.
And I'm going to appreciate and highlight what you just said. As a guy who ran a police department, we have incredible police leaders out there, the overwhelming majority who seek the exact same thing as the black community, as other communities, and frankly, who are under-celebrated in the level of daily heroism that they show in conducting their jobs. As I just mentioned earlier in my testimony, in my questioning about the 2 Linden police officers. But what people don't realize is that goes on every single day. People out there putting themselves in harm's way who do share our same values. But what you so astutely pointed out, that a lot of this is not conscious. Sometimes people aren't even aware of how they're not applying the law equally. And when I see Justice Department investigation after Justice Department investigation, police departments large and small, police departments run by African Americans as well as white folks, all coming up with the same set of data that's presenting the same fact that we do not have the equal application of the law. When we have prisons that are now full of folks that, whether it's Vermont, where there's 1% African Americans, but they have 11% of their prison population is African American, or states like mine, this dramatic unequal application of the law throughout the entire justice system. We've got to get to the core of this understanding of what can we do to begin to correct for this implicit racial bias. And I conclude with just saying, your prescription of having better national collection of this data, we cannot get there unless we first engage in an objective, dispassionate analysis of the facts and the data. And the fact that we don't collect them 60 years, 50, 60 years after the Kerner report is outrageous and unacceptable. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Booker. Senator Carper?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, just before we break up, we came here with a hearing in mind to how do we better protect our homeland from threats, foreign and domestic. And I want to thank Senator Booker for adding something that I didn't expect. And I really want to say to Director Comey, thank you for the way you've engaged on what I think we all know is an important, really important subject. When we've spent many years, in many months in this room years ago on the heels of 9/11 with the 9/11 Commission led by Lee Hamilton and Governor Kane. And they had a vision that we would address and fix some of the problems that led to 9/11 and allowed it to happen. And part of the problem was the stovepiping of information, our inability to work together, to talk together. And I know, Mr. Comey, you said several times we're not perfect, and the goal is to always be more perfect. I like to always cite the preamble of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. It doesn't say in order to form a perfect union, but a more perfect union. None of us are perfect. I always look at problems and I say, find out what works, do more of that. And everything I do, I know I can do better. And the same is true of all of us. But I must say, I am encouraged by the way you work together and the way your agencies work together. I think we're all better for it. As Jay Johnson prepares to end a couple months for more fertile fields, maybe, I don't know. But I want to close, Mr. Chairman. The Chairman and I are baseball fans, and you may be as well. One of my favorite Detroit Tigers players was an outfielder named Kirk Gibson. And when he had a memorable home run playing for another team, for the LA Dodgers in the World Series, it sparked them to a World Series victory. But years later, he's back with the Tigers. Middle of the season, he announces that he's going to retire. And he does it in a very different way. Usually when people are going to retire from baseball or whatever, they do it at the beginning of the season, or they do it in the middle of the winter, or they do it in spring training, so I just don't have anything left anymore. He did it in the middle of the season, and he called the press corps to the Tiger dugout in July. And he said, I have an announcement to make. I've been traded. And people gasped. And he said, back to my family. So, Jay, we're going to trade you back to your family, but you come with our best wishes and affection and our thanks to your wife, Susan, and to your family. God bless.
Thanks, Senator Carper. Again, I also would like to express my appreciation. I've certainly enjoyed working with the Secretary Johnson. I think you've done a lot of good work, and you've hired some great people, and you've improved the department, so thank you. Gentlemen, thank you all for, again, your service to this nation, for attending this hearing. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until October 12th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.
Good, good.